Hi, everyone. I don't know if I have a more clever title, but at least one that's going to stick in your heads for the rest of my talk, at least. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Jenny especially for inviting me to give you guys a talk about some of the work I've been doing as part of my PhD down at the Australian National University. And just like many other people have said, I certainly couldn't have done this work without a huge number of collaborators, and I'd just like to give them a little shout out right here, especially Dom Raj, who's another PhD student down at ANU, and whose work is going to be a large part of my talk today, so extra special shout out to him. So why do I study locomotion? Well, for mobile organisms like fishes, movement actually means choice, where they're going to go, what they're going to do when they get there. And for fishes especially, movement and swimming actually makes up a large part of what they do in their day. They swim to do just about everything. And for anyone who's gone to the pool to swim laps before knows, swimming is actually pretty hard work. And so any changes, even small changes in the amount of energy or the amount of activity that you're doing on a day-to-day basis is going to have a really large impact on the energy that you have left for other things like growth and reproduction and repair. And as a result, I would argue that swimming performance, therefore, is a really important imposes a really large selection pressure on fishes to be the very best swimmers that they can possibly be for a given environment that they find themselves in. Now, to add a challenge to that for fishes, water flow mediated by waves and currents is a really important physical stressor on coral reefs and other kinds of aquatic habitats that fishes have to deal with. And I'm very well aware that this is at odds of what we tend to think of when we're imagining a coral reef habitat, but the reality of living in shallow marine environments for fishes looks a little bit more like this. Exposed shallow reefs routinely experience very high and very intense amounts of water motion imposed by waves, for instance, or currents. Not to mention the severe increases in these amounts of water flow experienced during things like storms. Now, to put these challenges into perspective, fish have to carry out all of these daily activities that we were just talking about while moving in basically the equivalent of cyclone intensity winds. So just think about what getting to this conference, for instance, would have been like for us under those conditions. And in case you still don't believe me, fish really do use more energy when they're swimming in oscillating flows. And so we did want to test this because we're scientists, I guess. So we wanted to see how wave surge actually affects the energetics of swimming performance in this temperate marine fish, the shiner surf perch. And so what we did, and thanks to Jody for warming people up a little bit on some of this respirometry stuff, but what we did was we wanted to look at the swimming performance in a respirometer. And what we did was we used computer-generated functions to oscillate the water flow in these swim tanks. So we had 3 treatments of fish. First of all, we were swimming fish in steady flow conditions, so just the typical flows and water motion that was not varying in speed. But we also had a treatment with small oscillations in flow. That's the green line here. So around the same mean speed, we were oscillating water flow around in very, very small amounts. And we also had a third treatment where we swam fish in very large oscillations of flow. That's the red lines here. And so this graph now shows oxygen consumption rate as a function of swimming speed. And just as Jody was saying before, we sort of use oxygen consumption rates as a proxy for energy use. So just think of it as though when you're out for a run, you're working really hard and you're breathing more, you're using more energy. That's basically what we're doing here. And as you can see, I hope anyway, fish use more energy when the waves are large. So you can see that there's no difference here in these. If you remember the colors, are steady flow conditions where we're not oscillating the flow. Not really any difference between the green and the blue lines. So small oscillations don't seem to be a problem. But these big oscillations in water flow speed really are causing fish to use a lot more energy to swim. Unfortunately for fishes, the situation is actually getting worse. And we don't tend to think necessarily about water motion as being something affected by climate change, but there's actually an increasing amount of evidence from a range of systems that the intensity and the frequency of severe storms and weather events are actually increasing around global oceans globally. So it is something that I think we need to think of a little bit more when we're assessing the impacts of climate change on marine organisms. So this all sounds pretty bad. But of course, some species are actually quite happy living in high flow and actually are really designed for swimming efficiently or effectively. And we can probably tell just by looking at different species which ones we would imagine to be better swimmers. Mr. Blobby over here is maybe going to be less happy in very wavy conditions. But I'm more interested in the intraspecific adaptations or acclimations, as Phil was talking about, that fishes have for dealing in water flow. So what are the changes that are happening within a species in order to survive in very different wave habitats? And I would argue that there are basically three ways that fishes can actually adapt to water flow. They can change their behavior to avoid or to exploit the flow. They can change their physiology to become more athletic, as Jody was talking about, or they can change their morphology or their shape to swim more effectively. And these adaptations are all very good for fish, but they vary a little bit as far as the time scale over which they operate. So when we're thinking of behavioral changes, these are really labile. They tend to happen very fast. They can be very, very short, minute-to-minute or second-to-second adaptations to the flow or acclimations to the flow. And of course, there's a gradient here, but we're ranging all the way down to morphology, which can be quite a slow process and take many years or generations to occur. So keeping those three things in mind, I'll just talk a little bit about, again, some of the research that I've been doing during my PhD to try to understand these three different types of adaptations or ways that fishes are going to be able to change in the face of water flow. So let's just focus on those quick minute-to-minute changes in behavior. Jacob Johansen, who's in the center when he was doing his master's, did some really great work to show how fishes can actually use structures on the reef to avoid that flow and save energy. But we were really interested in seeing whether or not fish can actually take advantage of predictable changes in water speed and direction, similar to dolphins riding a wave. I'm well aware that dolphins aren't fish, just in case you were worried for a minute there. Now, if I can get my video here, if you remember our little friend, the surf perch from before, swimming in those oscillating flow conditions, you can see, if you just pay attention to his pectoral fins, I hope you all can see in the back, but he's actually varying I'll do a little interpretive dance here, but he's varying the speed at which he's beating his fins, corresponding to the changes in water speed in the respirometer there. And that allows him, if you notice, to maintain his position within the flow chamber, by sort of matching his fin beats to the water flow, as it were. So we were really interested in looking at that behavior a little bit more closely. And what we found was there's actually a really tight relationship between the timing of the fin beats and the amount of energy or oxygen that this fish was consuming across different swimming speeds. So different swimming speeds are represented by these lines here. But basically what I want you to get away from this was that the fish that were able to time their pectoral fin beats better or had the higher variation in their pectoral fin beat cycle actually consumed less energy. So they were able to use the momentum generated by those sort of oscillations and flow coming along to use less energy and swim better at those speeds. Now, fish can also take advantage of waves when they're escaping from predators. And so I've got another video to show you. So what we wanted to do was look at the escape response behavior of juvenile fishes swimming by simulating really wavy conditions and initiating an escape response in them. I hope you saw that there. So when startled, fishes make this very characteristic sea start that we can track using high-speed video. And we wanted to see whether escape responses were affected by high water flow. And these results are part of a much larger study. But one thing that we found was that by timing the escape response with the wave, it was really important for these fish in order to gain more distance. So this graph here shows the distance traveled. Shows the distance traveled in unsteady water flow by 3 different species of damselfish. Now the light bars here are escape responses against the direction of the water flow. The dark bars here are escape responses with the direction of the water flow. And this maybe isn't very surprising, but fish performed better, in all species, performed better and traveled farther distances within a fixed amount of time when they used that predominant direction of the water flow to escape from the predator. And I think this result is interesting because it might suggest that fish can actually potentially exploit those changes in water motion in order to help them escape from predators. So we saw that there were some strategies, at least quick minute-to-minute strategies for dealing with water flow. But as we saw at the very beginning of the talk, waves really do make swimming difficult for fish, so they probably need some longer-term adaptations for dealing with water flow as well. So we wanted to see whether exposure to flow can make fish more athletic, and Jody talked to you all about this, so I'm glad she was before me. I don't have to go into it too much. But just for the next few examples I'll be talking about, we're going to focus on my friend, the spiny chromis, Acanthochromos polyacanthus. And what we wanted to see was, we know these guys can live across a really wide range of environments on the coral reef, and we wanted to see whether or not that natural exposure to different wave conditions is going to make some individuals more athletic than others. So we know what we wanted to do is if we take individuals that are naturally living out on these exposed conditions, this is Lizard Island for those who don't recognize it, and whether naturally living out in the exposed conditions out on the front crest versus individuals that are living out in the sheltered, more lagoonal conditions, if there's going to be any differences in their abilities to swim. So this is another oxygen consumption rate curve that we saw before, similar to what we saw before. And what I want you to take away from this is that fishes that were collected from the wavy habitats had a greater aerobic scope or aerobic capacity. They used less energy at high speeds, and they also swam overall 33% faster than their conspecifics that were collected from the sheltered habitats. So that really seems that exposure to water motion out in the wild is really giving these fish an edge when it comes to swimming. So of course, next thing we wanted to do was to see whether or not these differences really were due to water flow and whether or not we could rear fish in different conditions and generate similar responses. Oops. So I've got some videos here of this split brood experiment that we did. But basically, we wanted to see how plastic these physiological responses were. And so we collected juvenile fish from the same sheltered and exposed tanks as we had before. And you just saw an example of one of the wave tanks that we reared fish in versus a calm tank. But the great thing about Acanthochromos, as other people before me have said, is that we really can manipulate them easily in the lab, collect them when they're very, very small on the reef. And what we did, that's exactly what we did. Collected different broods on the reef. We tagged them. We split them into these different conditions, either in a wavy tank or a calm tank. And we reared them there for 9 months and then tested their swimming performance. And what we found was that swimming performance really is quite plastic. Fish reared in our wave treatments had an increase in aerobic capacity and were also about 20% faster than their conspecifics, or even their siblings, reared in calm tanks. And that's regardless of where they were caught. So regardless of whether they were from parents that were naturally more athletic than others. So I think that was really, I was very excited about that result. And that's all well and good, but these fish were really small when we collected them on the reef, of course. What about adults? What capacity do adult fishes have to adapt to changing conditions? So I've got a video here for you as well. And we basically developed, this is done with Jody, basically developed a fish boot camp for our little guys. I'm glad I wasn't doing it, but we collected fish again from our same favorite exposed and sheltered sites out at Lizard Island. I brought them into these big flow tanks that you just saw and had some of them training there for about a month, and some of them that we put into calm tanks where they weren't getting any additional exercise. And then we came back after a month of swimming and tested their swimming performance. Now these results are still quite preliminary and we have a lot of work still to do, but we found that fish do seem to become better athletes after training, both in the fish from the naturally exposed and from the naturally more sheltered conditions. However, interestingly as well, I think that previous exercise does seem to be counting a little bit here. Those fish that were from the exposed habitats where they were really naturally athletic in the first place, even after a month of not doing very much, still retain some of their athletic abilities. So maybe that's hopeful for those of us this week who maybe haven't gone to the gym as much as we should have. Anyway, we still have a lot of work, like I said, and we're looking at metabolic rates and blood and a whole bunch of other things here, but I'm quite excited about these results. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is some of these more slow adaptations, these morphological changes that happen. And when we're looking at fishes that swim with their pectoral fins, which is predominantly what we've been discussing here, fin shape can really enhance the ability of fishes to move and perform in different flow. And so we measure fin shape as an aspect ratio, and all that you have to remember here is that rounder fins tend to be better for living, for maneuvering and living in low flow, and tapered fins tend to be better for or more efficient for swimming at high speeds and are better in high flow, all right? So we wanted to know whether fish have different fin shapes, so relatively more tapered or less tapered when they're living in these different flow habitats. And so, again, focusing on our friend the Spinochromis, the first thing we wanted to look at was across the continental shelf of the Great Barrier Reef. And this is really great, because as you move from more inland sites out to the outer reef, we get this really natural exposure gradient that gives us sort of a natural experiment to look at these differences in morphology across the species, morphology and performance. So what we did was we collected fishes from different sites across the Great Barrier Reef continental shelf. And here, as you see exposure increasing along the x-axis here, we of course find this increase in wave energy, which is what we expected. But we see a corresponding increase in the pectoral fin morphology, or aspect ratio, so that's from rounded to more tapered. And that corresponds to increases in field speeds and as well increases in maximum speeds in the lab. And I just would like to acknowledge that this work was mostly done by colleagues from JCU and from abroad as well. I was lucky enough to be involved with it at the later stages. But what we wanted to do after that was look at an even smaller scale. So just at the scale of Lizard Island, where these sites aren't separated by very much, are we seeing the same types of differences? And the answer is yes. We do find predictable differences in morphology and swimming speed that we expect give these fish a biomechanical advantage for living in these high flow conditions. And now, just so you don't think, although I love these little guys to bits, just so you don't think I only am working on them or I've only focused on them, we've looked at this in a couple of other species from a couple of other families as well. And we find very, very similar trends. Again, fish with relatively more tapered fins tend to live in the exposed habitats. And this relationship obviously is a little bit different for some species, but the overall, I think, trend is is highly significant, and I think is really, really interesting. And I still have to explore this data a bit further. But we also know that water flow varies across very, very small scales on coral reefs. So even if just on one, if we have a reef profile here, we can see that the amount of water flow or water velocity varies quite dramatically, just moving down the slope a few meters from the reef crests, and then even as we go farther back into the back flat lagoon areas. So we want to know, even on these really small scales, can we still find differences, morphological differences in fin shape in different species? So what we did was we looked at 3 different species of damselfish that you can see along here, and sampled them on the reef crest, on the slope, and in the back flat reef. And we find exactly the same trends generally. We have more tapered fin fish living on the crests, with more rounded fin fish living on these areas on the slope and in the back reef where water motion is less. So there really seems to be this fine-scale partitioning of habitat in a couple of different species at least, with differing life histories as well, based on their fin shape, which I think is super, super interesting. And again, I need to explore these data further. If only I had another 10 years for my PhD, I could probably do it all. So just to wrap things up, is this a good news story? Well, I hope at least that I've shown you today that fishes actually have a pretty good repertoire of tricks for dealing with water flow on coral reefs. On short minute-to-minute timescales, we saw that riding the wave can help a fish save energy and also gain distance when they're escaping from a predator. We saw that, that by training, a fish can become more athletic by being exposed on the reef. And this can happen both in fishes that are quite small, but also it seems like there's an ability for adults to get trained up and become more athletic over time. And finally, we saw that in a range of species, fish seem to be able to produce a lot of variation in their swimming morphology or their fins that might allow them to colonize a really wide range of habitats. And we see this trend in fin shape assortment across both large and small scales. So I think it is maybe possible that individuals are assorting to sites based on their fin shape if they have a large amount of variation that's being produced in their broods naturally. And I think that's a really cool behavior that would be really awesome to study some more. Of course, not all fishes might have the capacity to adapt in any or at least all of these ways. And so there certainly will be some species, I think, that are likely to suffer consequences from the increases, the types of predicted increases in water motion that we were discussing at the beginning. But I think it's really important to understand, at least first of all, what sort of options are available to fishes, focusing on the widespread ones that we think are most likely to be able to adapt, and then focusing after that on, or moving on to species with maybe more restricted ranges, trying to understand how that might happen. I think habitat management is probably going to be important here. And with that, and I don't know, just because I think you've all been playing the song in your head since the beginning, but I just would like to acknowledge many sources of funding for this and people that have helped me do the locomotion, so to speak, during my PhD. So thank you, everybody.